Good morning, South Dakota Specialty Producers. My name is Melissa Niles. I am the Urban Ag Liaison for South Dakota Specialty Producers. I would like to thank you for joining us for Forage, Grazing, and Micro Dairy Operations with Sean and Beth Daughtery. This webinar was funded through a conservation collaboration agreement between the NRCS, National Conservation Service, and the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association to develop sustainable agriculture practices and environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA or NRCS. You can always reach out more to learn about our future guests, visiting their website or emailing them directly, which we will highlight those contacts at the end of the webinar. Good morning, and how are we today?
Very good. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes, excellent. You are in Ohio.
Correct.
That's right. So we've already got 2 hours more of chores under our belts than you guys do.
Yeah, I was frantically running, trying to get everything done this morning so I could be on. But yeah, it's a beautiful morning though.
Oh, it's glorious here too.
It's supposed to snow tonight. But
oh, wow. It'll be a little while till it gets to us. We're supposed to get that Thursday, on Thursday. Yeah.
Yes. It's supposed to be sunny again on Thursday, so I can live with that.
Good. Send that this way too.
Yeah. We were just discussing your ties to South Dakota. Could you let our guests know that you know where South Dakota is and you're familiar with our territory?
Yeah, we did a couple of workshops in the Rapid area in this past summer, and we have lots and lots of relatives in your area, including for us, big rancher, 8,000 acres, and my sister and her husband work for Custer National Park. So, or at least she worked for Custer National Park, and he runs a tour bus business.
And our son is at Ellsworth Air Force Base when he's not elsewhere, and currently he's in Germany.
Very neat. It's always fun to find all the South Dakota ties that people have.
Yeah, you live in a beautiful part of the country. We love it out there.
Yes, I came through Ohio in October, and that's a beautiful area too.
Yeah, we really
especially
love it.
The southeast corner is northern Appalachia, and that's just an unsurpassable part of the country.
I'll have to make it a point to go that way next time.
Yes.
Oh, so how are you familiar with micro dairies? Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Oh, we've been dairying since 1996, goats first, and then jerseys, and now Jersey Dexter crosses. We've kept, as many as maybe a dozen goats, and as we milk, at most we'd have 8 cows in milk at a time. We have marketed a good bit of milk, and because this is Ohio, that's in the form of herd shares, not direct market, just sales of milk. So we've, over the years, we've just sort of clocked a lot of experience with dairying and direct marketing dairy shares. Melissa, I can't hear you.
Yep, I was just making an adjustment.
I was wondering, I could see that our screen changed, and I thought maybe you were gone.
No, I'm here. So I became familiar with you when I was at the Homesteaders of America conference, and you were speaking on ways you can feed your livestock from your farm.
Correct.
So how do you do that with a dairy? Because most dairies are grain intensive.
Right. So one of the things that brought us to homesteading was the attempt to farm without a lot of inputs, farm without spending a lot of money. Everybody that we knew said, oh, it's really nice to farm, but you have to have $1 million to farm. And we said, no, both of our grandfathers, I was from Oklahoma, Beth's from Texas, they didn't do that. There was a way before the feed stores, before the grocery stores, when people fed themselves. And our kind of mission has been, how did they do that? And how can we do that? So one of the things that was very important to us was to explore ways, of course, that the farm could feed the farm. And what we found is that the cow on grass is this wonderful God-given approach to farming that feeds not only the cow, but it feeds everything on the farm. So we have found that the dairy cow is kind of central to the work that we do.
What we found too was that if you're going to, if you're attempting to get away from bought inputs, then the flip side of that coin is discover what your land produces well and figure out what it's good for. And that's, you know, that's not even very challenging once somebody cracks the code for you. Your land, if you didn't buy a parking lot, it's producing, or didn't buy something in the Badlands, right? Is producing a crop of some kind, and it's good at it. That's why it's continues to do it. It's a volunteer perennial native crop. And if you can figure out how to leverage what the land wants to do and let it take you the direction
It would go naturally.
that's right, as opposed to making up your mind, I want to raise Dutch belted cows and I want them to produce on average 5 gallons of milk a day. How do I start?
And another big problem in there is most people are overstocked. So you've got to, your stocking rates have got to fit how much food your farm produces.
So what we did was we looked at our land and said, well, what it's really good at producing is cellulose. And that's true of anywhere in the world, really, until human beings step in and say, I want to grow either a perennial crop like a tree fruit or an annual crop like grains and beans. I'm going to alter my environment so that I produce a whole lot of carbohydrates, maybe protein or fat. If you're looking at a natural landscape, 90% of what you're looking at is cellulose. And the trick about cellulose, it's what most plants are made of, is that it is not digestible by a macro animal. Macrozootics don't digest it. The enzyme cellulase that has to be used to access cellulose's food energy is almost solely the property of bacteria, fungi, and protozoans. We don't happen to be able to make friends with those and get them to make food for us, but cows carry them around in their gut. And so they swallow cellulose and they can turn, remember, it's 90% of what we've got to work with. They can turn that into proteins, fats, and sugars on a daily basis.
And the folks who say, and we hear it all the time, cows have to have grain in order to survive, is obviously wrong, because cows did for the very longest time survived on grass, and cows can still survive on grass. Our cows get absolutely no grain whatsoever.
Ever. They don't know what it is.
Right.
And that mistake is a natural one for people to make today, because we're accepting as a given today that we need to please a market that doesn't understand seasonality. We're accepting that we have to produce a certain amount of, we'll say milk in this case, certain amount of milk every day or every week, 12 months of the year. Nature won't do that for us. That when we insist on taking ruminants and inducing them to produce milk on as close as we can get to a level plane, you know, we're going to get they're going to freshen, they're going to go up. And then we want that slide down to be as slow as possible and to last as long as possible. Then indeed, we have to take animals whose biology, their nature, their structure is for grass harvest and seasonality. And we have to shove a bunch of carbohydrates in the front and get them to turn that into milk for us. That's an inputs heavy proposition. And it always puts the farmer at risk financially, because he's got to be a price taker, not a price giver.
One of the things that we found is very interesting as well is we recently bought from an Amish dairy a cow that needed grain. We were in a bind.
She was a temporary fix.
Right. So we did that. What we found is that the milk that comes from the milk that came from that cow was not the sweet, lovely milk that we get from grass, but it was just
It was a little chalky. It lacked the lactose. It just didn't have the same lactose levels. It surprisingly, to me at least, Butterfat actually is a product of long fiber. So carbohydrates don't boost butterfat the way you might expect them to. So we found there was a quality difference that we did not like in
And
that
that we were
grain-fed milk. That
a
was
little
about
bit
a
surprised.
6-week period in the winter, and it was pretty funny to realize this cow that we brought in just to produce a little milk for us in a gap in our, it hasn't happened in years, but it happened last winter, was as unsatisfactory as a milk producer, although she produced plenty, as we find grain feeding unsatisfactory as a method for our farming. And it's not just a money thing. It's also a dependence thing. If we fashion farm systems around grain feeding, we've decided, we've exceeded, we've given our permission to agribusiness to go on being heavily invested in big equipment, petroleum, and annual crops. You know, Melissa, I'm sure, as many of your listeners must, how fragile and how inappropriate that dependence has been. For the last 70 years, the United States has leaned very heavily on petroleum, big equipment, and annual crops, far in excess of what we need for human food. We can produce it cheaply. It's subsidized right now. It gives us some leverage on the global market, and therefore we produce a whole lot of grains and beans. And then what do you do with them? You lock up animals in confinement and you shove the grains and beans in the front end.
Now, we would also suggest that that's not the healthiest way for those animals to live. That there is some research out there. There's not a lot of research because you have to be able to research the cows that are grass only, and that's
there aren't a lot of them, and
right.
there's nobody wants to pay for that research.
But
right
anecdotally, what we find is that our animals are extremely healthy based on coats, based on and just looking at them. I mean, our farm is not the mud pit that so many farms become. Because we're rotationally grazing, which is an essential part of grass management with a cow. You must be rotationally grazing because you've got to be thinking of the cow and the pasture as one thing, not cow and pasture, not two things, but together they it is the two of them together that makes this
solar energy cellulose food conversion thing, food and fertility conversion thing happen.
And be able to continue.
Yeah, we kind of took your question and ran with it. I'm not sure if we were going where you wanted to go.
I have no problem with that. That's right. I was listening to your interview with Michael Kirkpatrick the other day, and I loved how you brought all the different almost like the permaculture in it, that it's all kind of you feed the cows with the land, and the land the cow gives back to the land, and it's all kind of a great cycle. I love that interview.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, the thing that we know from the plains is that the animals on the plains were able to give us feet of topsoil,
right, 16 feet of topsoil in the Midwest at one time,
which we have now destroyed, let blow away, let water wash away. But what we found, we started on a farm, our own home farm, which is mostly trees upside of the hill, but then a convent up the road that had been a pig farm, taken all the way down to just subsoil. And we have been watching our topsoil build.
That's right. So we had to dig a trench. It was for a path, so it only had to be about 5 or 6 inches deep. We had to dig a trench a couple of summers ago, and it had to be dug right through the middle of one of our pastures, and we didn't get to the bottom of the topsoil. Now 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, we soil tested that, and so we were out there digging up. We were using the Frisbee method, walking around picking up soil from different places. So we were digging holes all over that pasture. And nowhere was there more than about a ½ an inch of organic matter on top of the subsoil. When we dug that trench, we realized, okay, we've built at least 5 or 6 inches of topsoil in place in those years. That's That's an extremely exciting feeling. I think part of the energy and power behind the kind of work your producers are doing, the kind of work we're doing, where we've taken on in our small ways the agribusiness model. Part of the energy, part of what gives us the nerve to do that is that the evidence is so overwhelming that when you do honor the nature of nature, it produces more, it exceeds our need, it exceeds our expectation, so that all sorts of places on our farm we could take you and show you where the land has successfully provided our needs, because for many years we've eaten just from our farm, except for luxuries, we're just eating what we can grow. We started with land that had in no topsoil on either farm, and it's fed us and built fertility at the same time. The point being that solar energy harvest, when engaged in holistically, is greater than our need. It lays down surplus. I'm going to say every year, although we're in a historic, or the biggest drought this part of Ohio's seen in European history, in Western history. So I can't tell you whether we laid down a lot of fertility this year, but in the long run, it's fed us and it's grown in fertility every year. And that consistency, that vibrancy in nature, really puts wheels on the alternative ag movement.
And what's remarkable is we've done this with virtually no expenses.
Yes, right.
We have not seeded. We've only let the natural grasses come in. We have not irrigated other than just rain. We have not fertilized other than what the cows have done. We have turned nature loose and said, we trust nature. And if we follow nature's pattern, we call it God's pattern, but if we will follow that pattern and try and imitate how nature would do things, we find that the pastures improve. We have an incredible abundance of food, and the system really, the pattern really works.
And one thing that's always important, I know you know this too, when you're helping somebody begin to realize what's possible, is always to remind them there's a lot of ups and downs in life. Stuff dies, you get droughts, and when there are a lot of things that you can do to help yourself along that are perfectly legit, like the importation of organic matter to a place that has none, right? If when we help people on what's the word I want, to transition land from cropland to pasture land, one of our stock methods is bale grazing, bringing in from off this piece of property some good weedy native hays and feeding them in place to add organic matter. As long as that's an option, it's a great place for people to start. So those boosts, I can't remember who the permaculture guy is who says says he's not averse to using a little petro energy to give a big boost to a permaculture and landscape. He means use your chainsaw to move some trees if that's going to give you a big jump in the right direction. And the same goes for the use of inputs. It's building a system around inputs that we would want to see people avoid. Partly because it's insecure, and partly because it's never going to have the same ecological integrity and therefore resilience, abundance, that building a system without inputs is going to give you. But by all means, import that hay when you're starting out, if that's what you need to do to get.
I think another thing that people need to understand is that nature, we have to be very patient when we're working with nature. Nature does not work at the speed of the tractor. Nature works at her own speed. And when we become impatient and start trying to move it faster than nature goes, very often we start the degrading process.
It's a question of wisdom as much as anything else. If we step back for a minute and picture, say, the United States of America, we're a country of people almost universally experienced in technology, in human constructs, stuff that we've made. Vastly, the majority of the country lives, sleeps, works, and recreates in a man-made environment. So something we're lacking is just intimate, even instinctive on some level, knowledge of how nature behaves. It's an obstacle then for people who want to be organic producers or beyond organic producers, that we don't come with a set of instructions or a education, right? Experience with what nature can really do. And we have to, it's a really exciting ride. It's really fun. And it's great to have organizations like yours that are there to facilitate people sharing that experience. But we need to remember, we're all coming from a place of not just ignorance, but wrong assumptions.
And what we have been discovering, which has been very exciting, is that there are all kinds of manifestations of nature working well that we would never have guessed. But when we start seeing it, we say, oh, that's probably because of how this is done, as opposed to the grain method, as opposed to the petroleum method.
Right. Relative to that, here's an example that I just love. When we started on the rental farm, which is almost 15 years ago, 30 acres of no topsoil, hogged off land on a hilltop in Appalachia. We were also starting with cows that were directly out of the commercial dairy world. So they had no epigenetics, no recent learned experience passed down by any older cows about how to manage these forages, how to self-medicate on forages, etc. So we put them out on some really horrible neglected land that was largely briars and began rotating them. And the results were always encouraging. Things were good. We offered salt, high mag mineral in the spring, selenium mineral in the summertime,
Kelp.
and then periodically kelp, usually spring and fall. And the kelp was always a big hit because it's bioavailable for cows. It's a great way for them to get their broad spectrum mineral. And they would mob the kelp pan every time we moved them out there. So twice a year, spring and fall, we put 100 pounds of kelp in these cows. And we saw it as something that was going to be with us for the long term. Only one year we went out and filled the kelp pans first time in the spring. And then because it was on the back of the farm and we needed to move some fence, we went ahead and gave them their next paddock. And they walked away from the kelp and went to graze. And that told me a bunch of things, and probably tells you the same things, which is, I mean, it's a layered victory when that happens. Our soil is more bioactive, so the minerals that are already there are being naturally chelated and fed to the plants, and the plants make it available to our animals, so they're no longer dependent upon kelp. But it also tells you that our animals are acquiring and sharing pasture wisdom so that they know which plants to select when. I mean, we've all heard, oh, that's horse nettle, you got to kill it, it's poisonous. Horse nettle's a vital part of our pasture. And there are certain times of the year when you open a paddock gate And well-fed animals with full rumens move up to enjoy themselves. And the first thing they do is harvest some horse nettle berries. Then they go to their food crops. White snake root. You'll look it up sometime and you'll see this long, complicated, and rather romantic mythology built up around the plant white snake root. But the long and short is they'll tell you it'll kill your cow and it'll kill you.
And then a whole diatribe on the ways that you can eliminate it from the pasture.
Absolutely.
With sprays and poisons and bulldozers and.
When we're grazing in the fall, it's very easy for us to see that our cows consume white snake root with lots of options. They consume white snake root, but they don't consume very much. So if they have access to a lot, it'll be difficult to tell they've eaten it. Whereas if they have access to a little, they'll wipe it out. I know that the health I'm looking at, like beautiful winter coats, sparkly, fluffy, right? That's all going back to, that happened in that 7th year period when suddenly they're walking away from the kelp pan. And that's going back to that broad array of complex phytochemicals that my herd knows because they've been on the same land for a long time, and it's native and naturalized pasture and it's very biodiverse. They know what to eat. Actually, if you, with the white snake root, it's kind of fun to go and do your research, because what you'll realize is there has not been a successful research project demonstrating that white snake root is really toxic. It does indeed contain trematol as well as some other things that are technically toxic, but toxicity is in dosage. And the feeding research that's been done on goats and calves for white snake root, every bit of it that I can find, and there's not much, has had to force feed massive amounts of white snake root to reluctant animals to get any kind of toxic response. So that's one of the ways that when, we set out as two not particularly well off, very determined, and deeply convinced by our faith that the world made sense. We started out like that, and then we pushed through a lot of, you know how to, you've raised dairy calves, so you know the challenges that are inherent in taking animals from the commercial model and trying to do something sensible with them and make them healthy. And we had to live through a lot of that, but because we were dumb and determined, our friend Ken Clark, who's a dairyman from Pennsylvania, used to say, the best thing ever happened to you two is you have no idea what you're doing. And he meant that we weren't so indoctrinated into the modern commercial assumptions that we couldn't see another possibility. And we pursued that possibility on the principle that nature makes sense or we wouldn't all still be here, and that it should be possible for human beings to make a natural landscape better while leaving it a natural landscape. Your mic's off.
There we go. We did have a couple questions pop up.
Yeah.
Grace is asking, how do you have any suggestions on how to transition cows from grain exclusively to grass? I've also been feeding my fresh cow alfalfa as pellets. Should I consider doing that instead of grain when milking?
One of the first things we would say is the transition from grain to grass needs to be a very slow process. Don't hurry it along. We did hurry it along, and we've had some successes, but we have found also that it's a good way to have problems.
It's more important that you be attentive,
yes,
than that you follow a certain. In fact, you shouldn't have a calendar in your head. Some easy things. It's easier to start with a young animal. Cellulose, takes up a lot of space. Carbohydrates don't. So you need a big rumen on an all grass bovine, whether she's for dairy or for beef. And so the younger you start down that road, the better. We've transitioned a lot of animals onto all grass over the years. And I don't remember ever not being successful in that. In fact, we have to have been successful because we weren't losing them, and we don't feed grain. So they made the transition all right. In retrospect, no, not in retrospect, because we now hand out a lot of information in public, we backpedal that one a little bit because we can't know how observant and how much judgment somebody's going to be able to bring to that question in the beginning. And the last thing we want to see or hear is somebody who says, I bought a cow from a commercial dairy and shoved her out on the back 5 acres. And she got super, super skinny, right? Like, that's not how we would have you go about it. Some good tips. It's way easier to start that transition at green up time.
Right.
Because of the grass is already going to be high in protein. It's moving toward high energy. And those are the things you're having to sub in for as you withdraw grain.
And make sure you have plenty of grass. I mean, I think sometimes people think, well, there's grass out there. No, 8 inches of grass is, the height
Sort of your minimum.
is where,
right?
where you need to be. So when you're bringing a cow in, and then if you don't have that much grass, you need to be adding hay, and maybe, and then the
Right.
grains or whatever the cow
It's really
needs.
important as for dairy animals at all, right? It's fine if you're giving them a TMR, you can sort of say this is exactly how much they need, right? But if you're feeding forages, it's always important that they have enough forage in front of them that they can be picky and can meet their particular needs. So just here in Appalachia, I always calculate a lactating animal's grazing allotment for the day at twice that of a beef animal, because I want her, she's going to leave a lot more. She's going to, in quotes, waste that grass. It's not going to get grazed, but she needs to be picky. She needs to have higher quality, and she needs to be able to be selective about what she's eating. I would recommend, for somebody who's never done it before, first, be very comfortable with wherever your cow starts out. If she's eating a lot of grain, but she's the cow you could get your hands on, knock that back a little bit at a time. Give yourself permission to take 3 years to get her there. If that's what, if she's 2, she's dropped her first calf, but she's seen a lot of grain so far in her life, or a lot of some kind of concentrates, right? Look, she's producing milk for you. She's turning low quality food into high quality food. She's turning, if you're not just throwing money away, she's turning what is presently cheap, granted subsidized, but cheap feed into milk, meat, and manure that you can use on the farm, and of which you might market some. So it's a good. Transitioning her to all grass is a better thing, right? And that's where we're aiming. But if it takes a year, it takes 2 years to get her there, you're still doing a good thing and winning all the way through there.
And be ready to back off. So as you move her into grass and you're finding that her condition is going down,
right.
Just go back to what you were doing before.
Right.
And
in July, it's lignous, bump up her grain again. This is going to lead us to another topic that I think is super important when it comes to dairying on forages. And that's, we have to make some decisions and maybe some alterations in the cows we're dealing with and what we expect from them. Again, if you have a confinement animal on a TMR and you're trying to maximize her milk production through that lactation, you're going to have a whole different set of methods and a different expectation for her physiology than if you're trying to use tough, resilient animals in pasture. In our case, it's 12 months of the year, hustling their own grub and converting cellulose into meat, milk, and manure. We grass people need to rethink what we think condition looks like.
Mhm.
The animals that we're going to put out there and what we're expecting them to be able to do.
And
Right now, people are okay with the idea that a dairy animal looks like a rack of bones, a healthy rack of bones, but still very thin. And we want the bulk of what she consumes to come out the other end as milk. We don't want to put flesh on this animal. But an animal that's hustling her own grub and she's out in the pasture most or all of the year needs to have a bunch of things going for her. Sure, we've already talked about pasture wisdom. She also needs to have some muscle on her. She needs to have a level of vigor that isn't necessary in confinement. And I would offer too that because she's not being fed a metered out TMR, I know exactly how many pounds this cow is getting, and I know how she's converting it. Since we can't do that with a pastured animal, we want an animal who actually is going to, who's physiologically disposed to reduce her milk production
right.
before she puts her health at risk. So instead of having an animal that depends upon the dairyman to calculate her daily ration so that she makes milk and also maintains her health, we want animals whose bodies are smart enough to say, yeah, if I make it, you know, I'm making 20 pounds of milk today, but 2 months from now, the calf I'm carrying is bigger, the grass is more lignous, I'm going to drop back in my production. I want that in an animal. That means that I have to build whatever system I'm going to build around that, whether it's milk production for sale, whether it's milk production for cheese making or for just on-farm use or for feeding hogs or whatever. I have to build into my system something the market doesn't like, and that's seasonality. I have to start recognizing that nature requires an awful lot of inputs before she's going to try and hit that plateau of milk production that looks marketable. We have to begin teaching our consumers that their sort of toddler-like expectations, I get what I want when I want it, it's always there, don't match the kind of food they want. We need to get them to link their desire for the highest quality food with the seasonal limitations that nature places upon us.
Long answer, but that's how we would transition.
That's right. Yeah, right. Grace, I hope that wasn't too much.
Do you need a mic back on you?
I always forget that part.
There you go.
What advice would you have for producers who are in drought as South Dakota currently is?
Well, we're in the same situation, and it's new to us because Appalachia has always had an abundance of water. What we have found is we have had to, again, stocking rates are really significant, and you've got to recognize that in a drought, your farm is not producing as much food as it was when there's an abundance of rain. So that's one thing that you got to do is you got to change your stocking numbers. You may have to sell off some animals, butcher some animals. It's one of the reasons that we don't try and make our farm pay our bills. We want our farm to feed us very well, and then it does provide some cash flow.
Oh yeah.
But if we were desperate that it was paying our mortgages, we would probably find ourselves
compromising.
Right, farming not as well as we want to. Our primary consideration in terms of choices on our farm is how does this affect the soil? We're constantly saying every choice that we make has got to make the soil better. Every year we should have a better farm and not a worse farm. So if we started seeing erosion, if we started seeing the grass going down
Right, or in
and
the
not
gardens,
holding the water,
in the gardens, we'd see it in quality of produce and quantity.
we're starting to see soil blow away. We've got to change. It is a matter of management practices. We've got to make our management practices be the best that there can be and not be driven by financial considerations.
Or at least not, the financial considerations can come second, but they have to respond to the ecological considerations. Our lives have been, and we're in our 60s now, have been one long concentrated experiment in let's rediscover what nature will do for us when we refuse to do violence to nature. And this year has been really exciting for us. We are 4 years, maybe 5, into a prolonged overall drought. And this year, 2024, has been the worst drought for this part of the country, worst drought in recorded history. I'm glad to hear it because it's been really rough. And what it's meant is less forage, more seasonality in that we had to get through a summer of such minimal rainfall that we like our sine curve of forage production was missing a bump. We didn't get a bunch of growth that we should have gotten. It's exciting for me to see what the results of that have been like. The most important result is that because we rotate holistically and we move cows every 12 to 24 hours, sometimes it's 12, sometimes it's 24, depending on the season and which cows we're talking about, dry herd or lactating herd. That by itself automatically means we stock, our density is lower than our neighbor's density, right? But this year then, more than even any previous year, has demonstrated how much forgiveness that buys us. We have not had, so locally, the Eastern Ohio Grazing Council is a coalition of grass farmers in like a 5 or 6 county area in Eastern Ohio. So we have meetings once a month, and so we get to visit each other's farms and see how other people's practices are working out.
This is a excellent organization, and it should be happening all over the country. People should be visiting, people should be grazing, and the people who are grazing should be visiting each other's farms and having some leaders who will say, these are good practices and these are practices that might be improved.
And you'll be glad to hear that it was founded by and is held in existence by our local NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District. A handful of young farmers, local farmers who work for the USDA in those capacities, started this organization 15 years ago. And that it's a piece of tax money well spent, which is really nice for us to see. And they have the reach that we wouldn't have had otherwise to make this organization as big as it is and as helpful to people it is. But it gives us access to a lot of other grass farmers. And one of the things that's evident to us all the time is we understock compared to them because we're going to graze 12 months of the year. We want standing forage going into December, coming out of December, like January. We're moving on to standing forage that was stockpiled since July or August of the year before. Most people don't. They just make hay, keep big equipment, make or buy hay, and stock more heavily. It's one way to handle it, not our goal. So this year, being in a drought, we're in a position to know that all of our neighbors have had animals on hay since June or at latest July. We have not touched. We have had no need to get into hay in all that time. Now in September, we got a couple of rains that were just enough to boost production. We did get some late fall grass, and our neighbors will our first hard frost, they'll start grazing that, and then they'll go back to hay for the winter.
And it's been a mad scramble for hay.
There's
I
not
mean,
hay around here. It's having to be imported from a long way off. A lot of people have destocked, which we applaud, but we've been largely not unaffected. It certainly affected the way I was moving animals, what I was expecting from them. We only kept 3 in lactation through that. The others had calves under them maybe, but weren't being milked. It's given us some interesting information. So those native forages that we've encouraged by our biomimicry in moving animals in migration over these 30 acres or 35 acres, those native forages have been able to meet the challenge. There's enough biodiversity out there that there are species that, you know, can handle the long drought, the extreme heat. We never browned out, so our soil never went dormant, and therefore our grasses never went dormant. When that was going on all around us, there was just enough forage cover to shade the soil. So it, you know, what do we save? 20, 30 degrees temperature sometimes by having leaf mass over our soils.
so
And,
one of the things that when people say, how do I prepare for a drought? This isn't, you know, this is a little bit hard, but you have to prepare for drought 20 years ago.
every year
Right.
needs to be a
So
preparation
you
for drought.
really need to be thinking about, I need to be improving my soil. My grasses need to be going deeper. I need to be being conservative with my water. All those things need to happen. And I know that it's hard when you're in a drought to say, well, I should have done this. But well, in that case, then we need to be thinking, what's the next drought? And we need to be using practices that are making our farms always better, always deeper grasses, always better water.
So one example of that, right? When you're moving into a period of forage non-availability, the temptation, we all know it, is to open all the gates and let the animals hustle their own whatever, wherever, right? But this is the moment when, if you're forced to import forages, you've got the opportunity to choose a piece of the farm and set your bales out at, you know, a 40-foot spacing, use polytwine to confine animals, you know, around one bale, and start moving fence so that your animals lay down, sure, it's bought forage for the moment, but your animals are going to lay down a fund of organic matter, you know, waste hay, trampled, manured, and urinated on, that when you do get a rain is going to respond beyond any expectation you have if you haven't seen this happen before. We've seen people do this in the mountains above Gallup, New Mexico. You want to talk about an inhospitable environment. Now, it wasn't always. Those mountains used to be farmed by there were small farms like German and other European stock farming 40-acre plots up there in those mountains, and they were producing all their food and stuff to sell. But with conventional grazing practices taking over and non-seasonality on the part of those cows who are just eating whatever they can find, it's now so dry, and so there's still a ton of diversity up there, but not a lot of forage production. We've watched people use bale grazing in place, leaving residual, don't make those animals eat every bite, and get 3-4 feet of grass with the next rain, right next to spots that they're lucky if they've got, you know, 8 inches of grass. So this nature is never a negative. It's always giving you a positive, but you have to figure out, you know, sometimes it takes a little waiting and a lot of patience to see it. You know, a mudslide is devastating, but it's also going to come back at some point in and you've just moved a lot of topsoil when you do that, and so you're going to get some payback later on. I'm not applauding mudslides, because they're usually in inhabited areas the result of bad management practice. But I am saying we can see each knockout blow that nature deals us. We can see that actually is energy that's moving towards something.
Yeah, it's important that when we are doing our farming, that when we see something that's not working, we need to be thinking, this is not nature, this is my bad management practices. And what the solution is changing my management practices, not somehow thinking that God's being mean or that nature's being evil.
We have one spot on the rental farm where you can see erosion happen. And it's the one permanent lane on the whole farm. It gets used to take cows to water from one spot on the farm to another. And I know that's my management practices. Sometimes I can use bale grazing in the wintertime to break down the escarpments and fill in the holes and shade the ground and plant some seeds, and then we'll get grass in that one spot. But I can watch it from year to year respond to good choice, bad choice on my part. So it keeps us always aware of how fragile topsoil can be, how fragile biodiversity can be. I don't like to emphasize that, because the great thing about nature is that it's alive and it's working for you all the time. If you'll help it, it'll help you a million times for every help you give it. But it is fragile. We can make big choices that will show us in the short run that was a bad idea, and we need to be able to learn from that.
Your microphone.
I'm just getting over a head cold, so I don't want to cough a bunch.
Right.
How do your beliefs, practices work with your neighbors?
That's a good question. So I'm going to guess that we'll take that down a couple of directions. So what happens when you don't spray a patch of Canadian thistle, right? I can't remember who told me this story recently, that one day when they weren't home, their neighbor came by and sprayed herbicide on whoever I was talking to, their pasture, because there was Canadian thistle. Neighbors can go from skeptical, critical, to, some are appreciative, some are admiring, not very often. Joel Salatin always says all of his neighbors still think he's crazy, right? Highly successful, but crazy. We find that our practices bear fruit, visible fruit, even to somebody else, usually in the long run. Like in a 2-year period, somebody observing a patch of Canadian thistle is going to have to, if they're paying attention, see that, heavy grazing and the biodiversity of the farm replaces that patch of thistle with good forages. It's not as though, it starts at one corner of your farm, and if you don't spray it, it's going to take over the whole farm. It doesn't look like that. Not under good grazing practices. Sometimes people will stop and say, why didn't you come do that on, like, this is a rental farm. Do you want to rent my place and do that on my farm? Which is always nice. It's nice to feel like people are seeing the good results. But what we've seen in those cases is that those people are still seeing what we're doing through a commercial model. They want us to come do that for them and pay them a lot of rent because we've just upgraded their land. Other neighbors,
it's kind of funny where we are, although we are in Appalachia, we're in the country. Most of our neighbors live more or less in urban
Oh, yeah.
They mostly are mowing. Very few have, they'll have chickens and things like that, but very few are, almost nobody was running cattle.
Right. Yeah.
Within a mile or so of where
Right.
we
So
are.
most of our neighbors are actually, like suburban people who like a rural setting. You know the type. Buy 5 acres, put a house in the middle, put a horse out back to absolutely take it down to bare soil,
And then
and mow
mow a
the
lot,
rest.
right.
Right. So
Now we have in our area, which we love, is in the last few years, homesteaders are coming into the area. Now
yeah,
that's spread out in 5
Couple
to
of
20
counties.
years,
Yeah.
20 miles from where we are. And it's very wonderful we do visit those, and we do some kind of micro visiting of each other and watching the different progress that they're having, and the methods that they're using.
Yeah.
That we're learning things from, again, a bunch
We
of
all
people
have
who
so much to share.
don't really know what we're doing. So we say, well, this seems like this would make sense, and they try it, and
Right. It becomes a community very quickly. So that's one of the exciting things about neighbors is, anybody who's getting into this in the last 5 years, I know you heard us at HOA, and that organization is a good microcosm of how the nation has become food aware, food quality, safety, resilience aware. Since I think it started before COVID, but certainly since the COVID thing. And so, yeah, we started out with a lot of very skeptical neighbors. We knew, we weren't born here, and so around here you're not native until your great grandparents are in the cemetery. But we knew that the locals, had their names for us, and sat back and criticized what we were doing. But they were in general very tolerant when they had to actually deal with us. And now in the last few years, all of a sudden there's a whole lot more, and I don't know if the word is respect, but something like that for what we're doing. I walked into the cell phone repair shop a couple of weeks ago, never been there before. 3 people in there, 2 work there, and 1 was a customer. And the 3 of them are in this involved conversation about how our national food system is toxic. It's unstable. Now this is Appalachia, guys. This is the poorest part of the country. We don't worry about that stuff. We live on Doritos and Pepsi.
even the Amish here.
Yeah, right. This is not a place where you expect to hear 3 random people talking about food security and food quality, but it's arrived. We're there. And I think for your producers, your members who haven't been in this that long, you've come into this at a really blessed time where a lot of things are in your favor. Yep, she remembered to turn on her mic.
Okay, last question. As an example, when first transitioning and working to build your pasture, how many cows for meat would you recommend starting if you say have 5 acres to work with? Just 1?
Well, in Appalachia, I mean, we can't really speak for South Dakota, but where we are in Appalachia, we are 5 acres of pasture. Now here, what's interesting is farmland, here, people are starting to abandon farmland and it's turning into trees. So one of the things that we would recommend is if you have 5 acres and it's got a lot of trees, maybe cut down some of those trees in order to allow for pasture to come in. But here, if you had decent pasture and it was really
decent, so decent, okay,
you could run 2 or 3 cows.
Yeah, definitely. You could graze 2 steers on 5 acres, probably 12 months of the year, and fatten them on grass here.
As long as you are managing and rotating those animals.
Absolutely.
And a lot of people don't understand how small a paddock is. 2 steers can be on a paddock the size of
in 25 by 25 feet, maybe, depends on how big your steers are. But, here, for example, I can count on getting, I can graze at a rate of, on so-so land at a rate of, 150 cow days to the acre, no problem. Now that's not really what's happening, because of course we have seasonal flush, and I'll move faster, move slower to meet, to respond to how the grass is growing. There in South Dakota, depending on where you are, that one cow that you're proposing, yeah, that one steer might be exactly what you need to start with. And know that you're gonna, if you want to maximize your forage use, you are gonna have to rotate. We would recommend, that's at least weekly, better yet daily. It's a much easier chore than people think it's gonna be. Be prepared too, so you're rotating, you have 5 acres, you're moving that steer. Say he's on if it's 5 acres and he's on 1/10 of an acre paddock, which would be huge here, but might not be for you. Then you've got 50 days worth of paddock. You get, and paddock size is always a response to at what rate the grass is growing, and how much grass you've got in a given piece of land on a given plot. But if you get around that 50 and you get to day 49 and you say, hey, the 50th one, which was my first one, is not ready to go now, it shouldn't be grazed, there should be no hesitation about parking that animal on a small sacrifice paddock and feeding hay for that period of time. The benefits are going to be, you're going to lay down a good fund of organic matter where you're feeding the hay, and the rest of the pasture is recovering.
One of the things that we highly recommend is wherever you do a sacrifice paddock or you're containing your animals, do it on the worst part of your farm, where the briars are the worst. Let them really stomp that in and let their
And add a lot of organic matter.
And
Right.
you will be amazed. We did that in one of our areas, and we could not believe the next spring the grass
recovery. Mhm.
that had been where there had been briars.
And relative to that, for anybody who has not done any holistic grazing, you can get started in your education about grass and grazing with a very few principles and not very much equipment. To move forward from that, you have to be present and attentive. You need to be paying attention. Nobody who wants a quick fix, sort of latch key, turn it on, it goes, and I don't have to do anything about it, system should engage in trying to do managed grazing in a brittle environment like South Dakota. You could get away with it in parts of Appalachia to just keep, only if you understock, but you could get away with it for a while. But it's never going to be good enough to just say, here's the calendar, here's my paddocks, I'm going to match up days and paddocks and just keep my animals moving. Even here, when we see that going on a farm, we see degradation. We see, especially what you're going to see is the non-palatable or least desirable forage species taking over from the desirable ones, because the animals will, of course, graze favorite species first. The bigger the paddock, the more of that is available, and the other stuff gets skipped, gets lignous, gets old, gets non-palatable and even ungrazable, and your pasture is degrading. So as much as we, engrave on our tombstones as an epitaph, rah holistic grazing, but it's not something you can go to sleep on. You have to be prepared to be there and pay attention. And the great thing is, it's the most exciting, most rewarding thing after, being a wife and mother that I know. There's a million living things on each square foot of soil that want to be alive. And if you'll provide them with conditions that imitate what would happen if you weren't there, natural conditions, they will respond by living, reproducing, adding their organic matter to the soil, collecting sunlight. Just in infinite proportion to the work and attention you're bringing to it. Right?
We will be having a rotational grade.
Oh, wait, we lost you. We can't
Okay,
hear
I
you.
must have
Melissa.
double clicked. Here I am.
There we go.
We will be having a rotational grazing webinar with Daniel Salatin in January. So
Oh, very nice.
if you have more questions, they're more than welcome. I'm going to put your contact in the chats.
Great.
Not a very fast tabler. And I do want to encourage everybody, if you don't have it, they do have a book out. Came out in 2016 of Independent Farmsteader. I know it's available Hot Springs here. We have a homesteading store, and I've seen it in there. I've talked to the owners there, so it's pretty
We
cool.
just got a contract with Chelsea Green. We're about to launch a series of books on farming.
The Independent Farmstead Companion Guides. We're looking forward to those.
Oh, very cool. That is very cool.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the book. I did. I tend to audiobook most of my books, but it is. I've actually thumbed through that one quite a bit. I really liked it.
Great.
I do want to thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and knowledge on micro dairies, and our guests are welcome to, if they have more questions, please reach out to them. I gotta do this is the webinar was funded under the Conservation Collaboration Agreement between NRCS and South Dakota Specialty Producers Association to promote sustainable agriculture practices and environmental stewardship. My name is Melissa Niles, and I am the Urban Ag Liaison for South Dakota Producers. Please visit South Dakota Specialty Producers page to view our upcoming events. This webinar will also, if you want to watch it again, if you want to study some more, it will be available on our YouTube page in the upcoming weeks. And I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sean
Thank you
and
for
Beth.
having
Thank you,
us.
everybody.
I truly appreciate our conversation.
So do
Great.
I hope
we.
you have a blessed day.
You too.
Thank you,
God
you
bless.
too.
Bye now. I like the little hearts going up.